He waited years for justice, then watched it go through a shredder in seconds. Sergeant Major Thomas Ashton, 78, walked into his bank that morning holding more than just a check. He carried the promise of long overdue recognition. After years of paperwork and perseverance, the Department of Veterans Affairs had finally approved his retroactive disability compensation. The U.S. Treasury check he presented was legitimate, substantial, and hard-earned. But when he handed it to the young teller at Consolidated Trust Bank, her reaction wasn't gratitude or respect. It was suspicion. Jessica, the teller, barely glanced at Thomas's military ID or the official watermark. Instead, she labeled the check irregular and, without consulting a manager or verifying its authenticity, shredded it right in front of him. Just like that, a veteran's lifeline became confetti. The bank's policy was her shield, but to Thomas, it felt like betrayal. Shock turned to fury, but Thomas didn't raise his voice. Instead, he stepped outside, reached for an old contact, a direct line to the U.S. Treasury, and made a single call. Within minutes, federal agents descended on the branch, and what followed was a swift reckoning. For Thomas Ashton, it wasn't just about money. It was about respect. And that day, justice arrived not with noise, but with authority. They shredded a veteran's treasury check. 5 minutes later, the federal government arrived. Sergeant Major Thomas Ashton, 78 years old, and sharply disciplined even in retirement, walked into the Consolidated Trust Bank with a sense of hard-earned satisfaction. Clutched in his inner coat pocket was something he'd waited years to receive, a U.S. Treasury check representing his retroactive disability compensation from the Department of Veterans Affairs. For decades, Thomas had carried the weight of injuries sustained during a classified mission. After navigating the bureaucracy of the VA with relentless determination, the acknowledgement and financial recognition had finally arrived. This check meant more than money. It meant closure, respect, and the ability to finally fix his leaky roof and visit his grandchildren across the country. The bank was familiar. He'd been a loyal customer for nearly 50 years. Wearing his usual khakis, a pressed shirt, and a clean windbreaker, Thomas patiently waited in line. When he was called to the counter, he handed his check, ID, and deposit slip to a young teller named Jessica. Her smile was polished, but her trust in government-issued documents clearly wasn't. She frowned almost immediately. She held the check up to the light, ran it under UV, and scanned it with skepticism. "This check feels off," she said flatly. "The routing numbers aren't standard, and the paper isn't what we usually see." And Thomas explained patiently that it was a treasury check printed on official stock, issued by the Department of Veterans Affairs. But Jessica was unmoved. "Sir, our policy is clear," she said. "Suspicious checks must be destroyed to prevent fraud." Before Thomas could utter another word, before he could even ask for a supervisor, she turned, and with casual finality, fed the check into the industrial shredder next to her terminal. It was gone. The check he had waited years to receive. The compensation he had fought to have recognized. Shredded without verification, without empathy, and certainly without understanding who stood before her. The lobby grew quiet as Thomas stared in disbelief. "You just shredded a treasury check," he said, voice cracking. "That was real. That was mine." Jessica simply shrugged. "If you think it was legitimate, you can request a new one," she said, almost smugly. "Our policy is meant to protect customers." But no policy could protect her from what came next. Thomas didn't argue. He didn't yell. He simply walked out into the bright afternoon sun, sat down on a nearby bench, and pulled out his battered old phone. On it was a number he'd been given years ago by a general he once advised, now a high-ranking civilian in the Treasury Department. "This line is for when the system truly fails you," the general had said. "Use it if it ever does." Thomas made the call. Within 5 minutes, 2 black sedans with federal plates pulled up in front of the bank. 4 agents stepped out. 2 went inside. They weren't loud. They didn't make a scene. But their presence shook the branch to its core. Their badges read, "Office of the Comptroller of the Currency" and "U.S. Treasury, Inspector General." Inside, the agents approached Jessica and the branch manager. "We are here to conduct an emergency audit," one agent said, "and to investigate the reported destruction of a U.S. Treasury instrument issued to a decorated veteran." Jessica went pale. The agents quickly learned that Jessica had not followed proper protocol. She hadn't consulted her manager. She hadn't attempted to verify the check. She had simply acted on her gut feeling and a bias toward disbelief. The branch manager stammered apologies, but the agents weren't there for excuses. They pulled surveillance footage, transaction logs, and internal policy manuals. A regional executive from corporate arrived minutes later, his face ghost white with panic. Outside, Thomas remained calm as he watched the scene unfold. He received a call from Undersecretary John Harrison himself, his old comrade from active duty days. "Tom," Harrison said, "your replacement funds are being wired to your account right now. Full amount, immediate clearance. And everything that branch just did is under federal review. The teller is suspended. The manager is under investigation. And trust me, the entire bank is going to remember your name." Thomas simply said, "Thank you, sir." But it wasn't about vengeance. It was about principle. That afternoon, a quiet old soldier reminded a national institution that loyalty and service don't expire when the uniform comes off. Mistake a veteran for a fraud, and you'll learn that real authority answers with swift justice, not apologies. Tased on his own porch. What happened next? Shocked the entire neighborhood. John McKinley, a 68-year-old retired master sergeant, had served his country for over 3 decades. He'd been through combat in Vietnam, the Gulf, and multiple peacekeeping missions, but nothing prepared him for what happened on a quiet Tuesday morning in the comfort of his own home. That day, John wasn't thinking about war. He was getting ready to walk his service dog, Valor, a loyal golden retriever trained to help him manage the nightmares and anxiety that lingered long after his military service ended. Dressed in his usual casual wear, John opened the front door to what he thought was a routine day. Instead, he was met by the sudden rush of boots on pavement, flashlights in broad daylight, and a wall of shouting voices. "Drop the weapon! Get on the ground!" screamed one of the SWAT officers, their rifles pointed squarely at John's chest. The only weapon he held was Valor's leash. Startled and confused, John barely had time to respond before a jolt of electricity ripped through his body. He collapsed onto his porch as Valor barked protectively beside him. They had the wrong house, but nobody realized that until it was too late. Within minutes, the front door of his small suburban home was breached. Furniture was overturned. Drawers were ransacked. The SWAT team swept through the rooms with military precision, searching for a criminal who didn't live there. John was handcuffed on his porch, his limbs still trembling from the taser, unable to speak clearly through the pain and shock. Valor, who tried to defend his handler, was nearly subdued with force until an officer finally noticed the service dog vest beneath his fur. Only then did someone begin to question what they were doing. The error was discovered by Captain Miller, the SWAT team leader, who realized they'd been given the wrong address. The real target lived 2 houses down. The numbers had been misread, and no one had double-checked the intelligence. John McKinley, decorated veteran and local homeowner, had been tased, cuffed, and humiliated for absolutely no reason. But the story didn't end there. Unbeknownst to the SWAT team, John had managed to send a quick emergency text to a friend from a veteran support group just before things escalated. That friend had direct ties to a powerful veterans advocacy network. Within minutes, a call reached the governor's office, and that triggered a chain of events that would make history. Just 6 minutes after John was tased, the unmistakable rumble of military-grade vehicles echoed down Oak Street. 3 olive-drab Humvees and a National Guard troop carrier appeared not for a parade, but for a mission. Out stepped Major General Samuel Armitage, commander of the State National Guard, and, as fate would have it, John's former commanding officer from their last tour in Iraq. Armitage didn't hesitate. He walked past the SWAT officers, many of whom looked confused and intimidated. He knelt beside John and quietly said, "Mac, it's Sam. I heard what happened. We've got it from here." Then, standing tall, the general turned to Captain Miller and issued an unforgettable rebuke. "You tased a decorated veteran because you couldn't read a house number?" Miller stammered, tried to explain, but Armitage was done listening. "Your team is relieved. The National Guard will secure this area now. There will be a full investigation." That's exactly what happened. Medics tended to John. Valor was checked and comforted. The state police and the Department of Justice were called in to handle the aftermath. The actual suspect, hiding quietly 2 doors down, was apprehended without incident an hour later. Over the next several days, John's home was restored, his medical bills covered, and a formal apology was issued by both the governor and the SWAT leadership. But more importantly, the event led to sweeping reform in how law enforcement verifies addresses during raids, and how they're trained to interact with veterans and service animals. The SWAT officer who pulled the taser was suspended pending investigation. Captain Miller was placed on administrative leave. Meanwhile, neighbors who had once seen John as just a quiet, old man with a dog now visited him daily with meals, support, and heartfelt thanks. His quiet courage had sparked a reckoning. Major General Armitage continued to visit, sometimes just to sit on the porch and talk. "Mac," he said one afternoon, "the system failed you, but we didn't forget who you are. That matters." And it did. Because when a hero is wronged, justice shouldn't arrive as an apology. It should arrive in the form of action, accountability, and honor the check that was shredded, and the call that shook Washington Sergeant Major Thomas Ashton, a 78-year-old veteran who served his country with honor across 3 wars, had waited years for justice. The moment finally came, in the form of a thick, government-issued check retroactive compensation for service-connected injuries sustained in a classified operation. That check, issued by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, symbolized far more than money. It was recognition, closure, a chance to fix his roof, and maybe visit his grandchildren out west. Ashton walked into Consolidated Trust Bank, the same branch he had used for over 40 years. Wearing his neatly pressed khakis and a clean windbreaker, he waited patiently in line, clutching the check in his inside pocket. When it was his turn, he handed the check to a young teller named Jessica, along with his deposit slip and government-issued VA ID. He expected a routine transaction. Instead, he got a moment he would never forget. Jessica's smile was stiff, her voice laced with suspicion. She examined the check under a UV light, frowned, and began scrutinizing it under the harsh fluorescent bank lighting. "This looks unusual," she said. "The paper doesn't feel right. The routing numbers seem off. I can't accept this." Before Ashton could offer verification or ask to speak to a manager, she turned and fed the check into the industrial shredder next to her terminal. The sound of shredding filled the bank lobby like thunder, and with it, 30 years of sacrifice, months of paperwork, and a long-awaited resolution were reduced to confetti. Ashton stood motionless, his voice barely a whisper. "You just shredded a United States Treasury check." Jessica only shrugged. "Bank policy, sir." By now, other customers had taken notice. The branch manager, Mr. Henderson, began approaching from across the lobby, but Ashton didn't wait. He turned and walked out into the sunlight. Sitting on a nearby bench, heart pounding with restrained anger, he reached for his old cell phone. This wasn't something a branch manager could fix. He needed the number that had been given to him years earlier by a certain young captain who had grown up to be none other than the Undersecretary of the Treasury, John Harrison. The call connected on the first ring. "Tom? What's going on?" Harrison asked. Ashton gave him a calm, precise recap of what had just occurred. When he finished, Harrison was silent for a moment. Then came the fury. "She shredded it? Don't move." Harrison made 2 calls, one to the office of the Comptroller of the Currency and the other to Treasury's Internal Inspector General. Less than 5 minutes later, 2 dark sedans with government plates pulled up in front of the bank. Federal agents entered the branch, flashed their credentials, and immediately requested access to security footage, teller logs, and internal procedures for handling suspicious checks. Jessica, pale and shaking, was escorted to a back room for questioning. She admitted she hadn't followed full protocol. Her gut had told her the check was fake. She ignored bank policy, ignored the veteran's documentation, and destroyed a legitimate government payment on impulse. Mr. Henderson, the branch manager, was visibly shaken under questioning. He offered apologies and excuses, but the agents were not interested in rhetoric. They were there to protect the integrity of the U.S. financial system and to make sure no veteran was ever treated that way again. Outside, Thomas Ashton sat quietly, watching the suits move in and out of the building. One of the agents gave him a respectful nod as he passed. A short while later, Harrison called him again. "Your funds are being electronically transferred into your account right now. The bank's regional director is on site. Jessica has been suspended. The manager is under formal review, and the Secretary of the Treasury is personally aware of this." Thomas, never one to seek the spotlight, simply said, "Thank you, John." To which Harrison replied, "No, Tom. Thank you for everything." As the day wore on, the audit continued. The bank executives looked visibly humbled. What had begun as a condescending dismissal of an old soldier had become a full-scale federal investigation. By that evening, Consolidated Trust had issued a public apology. Ashton's story spread quickly among veterans groups, financial regulators, and social media. It was more than just a banking blunder. It was a moment of national reckoning. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come with a loud bang. Sometimes it walks in quietly with a badge, a suit, and the authority of a nation that still remembers who its heroes are. It was supposed to be a quick stop at the grocery store, but for retired Marine Corporal Henry "Hank" Brooks, it turned into a moment he'd never forget. Dressed in his old service jacket and wearing medals earned from years of sacrifice, Hank stood quietly in line at the checkout. When the young cashier noticed his military ribbons, she smirked and whispered something to her co-worker, prompting snickers. "Nice Halloween costume," she mocked, laughing. Hank, 82, said nothing. He didn't want pity, just his groceries. But what happened next shook the entire store. A man in civilian clothes stepped forward, revealing the stars of a 4-star general on his concealed ID. He'd overheard everything. The store went silent. "This man," the general declared, placing his hand firmly on Hank's shoulder, "is a decorated war hero. You don't laugh at that, you salute it." Within minutes, the store manager arrived. The cashier was escorted away, and Hank's groceries were paid for in full. But more than that, his dignity was restored. Life lesson. Respect is never outdated. We may live in a fast-moving world, but true honor remains timeless. The quiet courage of our veterans deserves more than a nod. It deserves gratitude that echoes through generations. Let's be the kind of people who speak up when respect is missing, even in small places like a checkout line. Call to action. If this story moved you, leave a comment below with the word respect to show your support for our veterans. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us of what truly matters. Because some heroes don't wear capes, they wear uniforms.